Three reasons explaining why the Louisville football team is the dark horse to make the ACC championship, coming up on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to thank you all again for making us your first listen of the day. As I mentioned, today's show is all about identifying and explaining three reasons as to why the Louisville football team, is the dark horse to make the ACC championship game in the winter, from returning players to key transfer portal additions, and finally a favorable schedule. We'll talk about all three on today's show. Beginning with the first thing, we'll kind of go in chronological order and kind of build upon each reason. The first reason is kind of the base of the foundation of the argument, and that is the returning players. Now, before we talk about the returning players, I do want to talk about what I'm trying to argue here, because I know that people will see the title of the episode, people will hear the cold open of the episode and say, oh, wow, Dalton Pence is saying that the Louisville Cardinals are going to the ACC championship in year one under Jeff Brom. I'm not saying that. However, what I am saying is that Louisville is starting to become a trendy selection for teams that are kind of flying under the radar. It seems like Louisville's kind of a trendy selection for national college football analysts, talking about teams that could arise and make some noise in 2023. Now, when I say dark horse, I truly mean, the definition of the term. That is, maybe not necessarily favorable to do it or likely to do it, but it definitely is possible if things go the right way. And we're going to talk about three reasons why things may go the right way and what obviously will have to happen. But I found it interesting. In a new podcast from the Third Banner Pod, which is hosted by some of my friends in a infamous Louisville Discord. New podcast, by the way. Go check that out on all streaming services. Fantastic. They do fantastic work. But they had an episode with a special guest a couple days ago with national college football handicapper Brad Powers. And Powers essentially had a lot to say about Louisville. He said there's a scenario where Louisville could be in the ACC championship in year one. And I think that I don't want to get to a position where I'm being a sunshine pumper, but I'm also not going to be a Debbie Downer either. I've gone on record and said that I think Louisville realistically is probably about 8, maybe 9 wins, depending on how the out-of-conference schedule goes. More specifically, Kentucky and Notre Dame, and then you have some certain ACC matchups we'll talk about in the final segment of the show. But the schedule is very favorable. But realistically speaking, I think you bring back a decent amount of talent. You had a very successful recruiting offseason, and you have a very favorable schedule. And I think all of those combine to present an opportunity to at least put your name into the conversation. Now, understand that in this new scheduling format, there is no such thing as divisions any longer. It's the top 2 teams, conference winning percentage-wise, that make the ACC championship game in December. Now, that obviously can bode well for Louisville, considering that schedule. Before we talk about the schedule, let's talk about the returning players. We are in a era of college sports that's never been seen before. There's never been anything like it. It's uncharted territory in terms of, what is going on in terms of the transfer portal and NIL, and rosters have never seen as much turnover as they have in the past 2 seasons with that one-time transfer rule. Now, we've seen players leave Louisville over the past couple of cycles that have kind of hurt in the long run. Obviously, Tyler Harrell leaving. And then obviously you have Monty Montgomery and Dorian Jones going elsewhere in this cycle, and then Luke Kandra as well. But overall, you have to feel good with the retention that Louisville had from the guys that were able to come back. I wonder if my dog is going to bark for the entirety of the show. I do hope not, but we'll see. It's his world. I'm just living in it. But please disregard that. But overall, you look at the returning core that you're bringing back. And we'll start out on offense. Obviously, you lose Malik Cunningham, so it's going to be pretty different in terms of what you're looking at offensively, because Malik Cunningham is a multiple year starter. It's going to be a different signal caller, but it's also going to be a different offense, one that's obviously very favorable. Jeff Brom runs a great offense, but you bring some key pieces back. You look up front, Brian Hudson, one of the best offensive linemen in the country, and then you have Renato Brown and Michael Gonzalez, who are very versatile, can play on the boundary, but also on the interior as well if need be. So you return 3 key pieces on the offensive line. You lose a good amount of running backs, Tyon Evans, Travion Cooley, and Jalen Mitchell. But at the end of the day, you have to feel good about the returning pieces, because Jawar Jordan looked like a star in the making at the end of last season. Maurice Turner had some big time, opportunities in the final couple games, and he made the most out of those opportunities. So you have some skill in the backfield. You look at the tight end position. I think that's the one position that you look at, and it might be the weakest on paper. And then wide receiver wise, you lose Braden Smith. You lose Chance Morrow to the transfer portal. You lose D. Wiggins to the transfer portal. Tyler Hudson, 1,000-yard receiver, goes to the NFL draft. But you bring guys back like Amari Huggins-Bruce, who has shown that he can be lightning in a bottle. I have a lot of high hopes for Chris Bell, the true sophomore from Mississippi. I think that, he has an opportunity to really establish himself. But offensively speaking, I think that this is probably more of a unit that was affected more via the transfer portal than, perhaps say the defense. But offensively speaking, I think that you have some pieces to build off of. You didn't lose any truly key players outside of maybe Luke Kandra to the transfer portal. D. Wiggins only played a handful of games before getting injured. Braden Smith, obviously, I think was probably on the outside looking in. Same with Chance Morrow. So you have some pretty solid additions, and then obviously the high school recruiting classes with William Fowles, Jalil McClain, the offensive lineman Madden Sanker, Luke Burgess, Joe Crocker, Jamari Johnson at tight end. There's some solid reinforcements that were added via the offense. Defensively speaking is where I'm interested, to see that returning depth. The linebacking core was hit by the transfer portal. Obviously, Monty Montgomery to Mississippi, Dorian Jones to Cincinnati. You lose Momo Sanogo to the NFL draft. But if the spring game taught us one thing, it's that, some of the younger guys that didn't necessarily get a lot of opportunities may be ready to step up. Speaking of guys like KJ Cloyd, TJ Quinn, Jalen Alderman, Jackson Hamilton, some talented high school players that just never got the opportunity yet. And I think that they're going to see some, large roles in the linebacking position. I think that, who knows, we might see some more players get added. Defensive line wise, sure, the big storyline is you lose Yasir Abdullah and Yaya Diaby. And then obviously Keitrell Clark as well in the defensive backfield. But having a guy like Ashton Gillotte back, who projects to be one of the top pass rushers in the ACC this upcoming season. You have guys like Jared Dawson and Des Tell, who I thought really, really played well last year and got better as the season went on. And then you have that depth as well in Tawfiq Thomas, Ramon Puryear, Jermaine Lole, if he can stay healthy, Mason Rieger, so on and so forth. And not to mention also a highly rated, outside linebacker hybrid in Popeye Williams, who has, gotten a ton of high praise in spring ball, so on and so forth. Cam Wilson as well. So you bring a lot of talent back on the defensive line. The defensive backfield, like I said, Ben Perry, Jarvis Brownlee Jr., Quincy Riley, Josh Minkins Jr., MJ Griffin. You bring back a good amount of production there. You also have a guy like Trey Franklin, who has been with the program for the past couple of seasons. So I think that having that returning experience is something to build off of. Now, obviously, it's not the end of the line. It's not, the full picture, because to get the full picture of why Louisville could make the ACC championship and why, in my opinion, they are a dark horse to do so, I think that you have to now see that, they didn't lose a lot to the portal. Sure, you had players go to the NFL draft. Defensively speaking, you lose Malik Cunningham, you lose Tyler Hudson, Caleb Chandler, some key pieces on this team. But I have to feel like Louisville got out of the transfer portal with a win in terms of roster retention. So, but like I said, to tell that full story, you also have to talk about the additions via the transfer portal. Jeff Brom and company were extremely impressive in that regard. And we'll talk about that here in just a second after we talk about our friends over at Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack but don't want all the sugar and calories, then you need to get the best tasting protein bar ever. Built, you have to try it. If you're like me and you want to make healthier snack choices, Built is the way to go. It's healthy and it tastes amazing. It has all of the healthy benefits of a protein bar, but tastes just like a candy bar covered in 100% real chocolate. They have so many unbelievable flavors and the variety is off the charts. Churro, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, so on and so forth. If you go to Built.com, you can actually see the macros broken down, which it's amazing. You can not only get them on Built.com, you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. And while you can get specialty flavors still at Built.com as well. If you're close to Sam's Club running, grab that 13-bar box. If you're more of a Walmart person, go to the pharmacy section and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. Regardless, Built is the way to go. So heading on into the second segment, we just talked about the returning players for Louisville. It's now time to talk about the transfers. One thing I forgot to mention in that first segment that gives you a lot of context. I mentioned that Louisville was becoming a trendy selection by college football analysts. But not only them. Look at the betting sites. I want to read some odds off. According to Caesars Sportsbook, Louisville is plus 650 to win the ACC. That is third behind Clemson and Florida State, who are both plus 160 and plus 170 respectively. North Carolina's plus 800. And then you have Bet Rivers, who has Louisville as plus 1,500, which is fourth. Bet Online has Louisville at fourth as well. I think it might be 10-1 or something like that, 15-1. I'm not sure. Forgive me on that. But you see that this isn't just some misguided homer type argument where I'm saying, oh, look, Louisville's talented. They're going to make the ACC championship. I think it's not just a local perspective, but it's also kind of a national phenomenon and trend that people are like, look at what Jeff Brom is quietly cooking up at Louisville. Because he came in early December. Obviously, he did a great job Flyville 23 in the high school recruiting class, but he balled out in the transfer portal. He had like one of the top spring transfer portal time frames of any collegiate program in the NCAA. I truly believe it. I mean, if you look at who they added in the spring, completely overhauled the offensive line, got multiple players that had started multiple games for multiple years at their respective positions. They got immediate productive level defensive backs. They got a potential starting linebacker, so on and so forth. So let's look at the transfer portal as a whole. Louisville added 20 players in the transfer portal. I would argue that they addressed almost every single position of need. I still think that they need to add to the tight end position, but ultimately they've done such a good job. We talked about the offensive side of the ball. Let's stick to offense for a second. I think the spring game kind of highlighted that Louisville was going to be needing depth on the offensive line. With scholarships available, with open spots, Jeff Brom did what every great coach should do, and that is maximize the talent on the roster. Get the guys in now, figure it out later. That's the way to go, especially on the offensive line. You lose some veterans there. So what did he do? He went out and he got multiple grad transfers that have 1 year remaining, which, I mean, obviously is kind of a short-term fix, but it's something that helps for next year. You know, it helps you with an easy schedule to try to go, absolutely all in, respectively, as much as you can. Added Eric Miller, 6'7" offensive tackle from Purdue, started over 20 games the past 2 seasons, was a key cog on that team that made it to the Big Ten championship game. Lance Robinson, listed as an interior offensive lineman, started at tackle for Houston, started multiple games this past year. He could either play at tackle or on the inside. I think the key thing to focus on here with these offensive linemen that he added was that that versatility that they can either play outside or inside. Willie Tyler the same way from Rutgers. You also added Vincent Lamia from Duquesne and John Paul Flores from Virginia. So you added a handful of offensive linemen that you can trust, with that veteran presence to be able to help you out and protect your quarterback. Looking at the running back position, they needed to add a running back. They added Isaac Garendo, who's going to be a player that will at least, be able to compete for depth for the Cards. Wide receiver absolutely transformed. Got one of the best wide receivers in the portal, Jamari Thrash from Georgia State, the best wide receiver in the Sun Belt this past season. He is definitely going to be wide receiver 1 for the Cards. They went out and they also got some talented players like Jimmy Callaway from Tennessee, Jaden Thompson from Cincinnati, Kevin Coleman Jr., who had 500 receiving yards last year as a freshman for Jackson State, and Deion Sanders. So on and so forth. You added some players there and completely revamped the wide receiver room. Defensively speaking, is where Louisville really, really balled out in the portal. Actually, I should say they still added a quarterback, Jack Plummer, who, knows Brahms' offense, a veteran presence that had his best season to date last year for Cal. So offensively, you loaded up with weapons on the outside. On paper, one of the best wide receiving cores that Louisville's had in quite some time. Running backs, you're going to be fine. You've added the depth offensive line-wise. I think the only position that you're kind of maybe on is the tight end position, but we'll see if Louisville adds more because they still do have some more opportunities. Defensively, starting up front, added some players from the high school ranks to the interior defensive line, and they're still recruiting the defensive line as we speak, but nonetheless, they did add some defensive linemen. Rodney McGraw from Penn State, redshirt freshman who appeared in a couple games, but can play both outside and inside. Stephen Herron, Louisville native from Trinity High School, 4-year letterman at Stanford. So that's something to look forward to as well, being able to get that opportunity to bring him home and give him, the opportunity to replace Yaya Diaby or Yasir Abdullah. Linebacker was a position of need. They went out and they got Keith Brown from Oregon, who, judging based upon what a lot of the media was saying up in Eugene, was a player that probably was going to start for the Ducks and Dan Lanning's team this season. And then the secondary, they went out and they got a bunch of talented players. Marquise Groves Killebrew, has a local ties to Louisville from Texas A&M. You also have a guy in Marcus Washington from Georgia who gives you some depth, 4 years of college eligibility remaining. But mainly the thing to focus on is the veteran leadership that they brought in. Storm Duck from Penn State, well, actually North Carolina via Penn State, and then decommitted from Penn State and went to the Cards, all ACC second team selection. You also have guys like Cam Kelly from North Carolina that gives you that depth at the safety position. And then not to mention kind of just going down the line, Gilbert Frierson from Miami at that outside linebacker position, Devin Neal from Baylor, so on and so forth. So, you bring back a couple of key pieces in that defensive front and in the defensive backfield. But not only that, is you pretty much addressed every need that you needed to on the defensive side of the ball. And credit to Jeff Brom for going out and getting it done. Easier said than done when you take over in the first week of December, because at the end of the day, it's one of those things where coaching carousels never really truly come there is no really right time. It's just a matter of, applauding the urgency. The schedule definitely allows you to be competitive year one. So we're going to talk about that. Right now, before we do that, I want to thank you all again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen every day. Tomorrow on the show, we're talking about why Louisville is going to get the over 7.5 wins mark. We'll also talk about leading into the final scholarship offer for Louisville basketball, so on and so forth. So, final segment of the show. discussing the football schedule. The roster on paper, obviously you have to play the games, but the roster on paper is pretty solid. The players returning, the players coming in, both via the high school ranks and the transfer portal. I mean, there's nothing else that needs to be said. I think, you could still add some players to the team, but ultimately you're sitting pretty good. What makes this opportunity interesting is the schedule that awaits Louisville. Granted, what I said, remember, the new scheduling format, ACC championship teams are determined by the top 2 teams with conference winning percentages. So as much as the out-of-conference games matter in the grand scheme of things, they're not playing too big of an impact on the conference seeding, unless there's maybe a tiebreaker. I don't know what the tiebreaker is if there's no head-to-head there. Is it ranking? I'm not sure there. Is it overall record? If it's overall record, of course, now the out-of-conference games do have a significance, and that's true because I think Notre Dame and Kentucky kind of determine the ceiling of this year's Louisville team. But you have a very favorable ACC schedule, and the main thing that stood out to me, and this is something that we've never seen before, Louisville will play Miami, Georgia Tech, and Virginia every single season, and then they will rotate teams every year. Guess who's not on the schedule this year? You remember when I talked about the top 3 teams that had odds to win or get to the ACC championship? Clemson, Florida State, and North Carolina. Guess who's not on Louisville's schedule this year? Clemson, Florida State, and North Carolina. So you're missing out on playing those 3 teams that are very good. I mean, Clemson and Clemson and Florida State are ranked like top 10, top 15, something like that. Forgive me on that if I'm saying it wrong, but it means that conference schedule is very winnable. Now, granted, you have to go out and you have to handle business, and that's obviously that's needless to say. But I do think that if Louisville handles business, respectively, I mean, I'm not saying that they run the table and go 12-0 and then they're competing for a spot in the playoff, but you look at the ACC schedule. You open up with Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is going into a rebuild, new head coach, first-year head coach. Even though that game is in Atlanta, in Mercedes-Benz, I think that Louisville's probably going to win that game by double digits. That should be a game that Louisville wins by double digits. Then you have, obviously, Murray State and Indiana. 2 more ACC games. Actually, you have a lot of home games. Look at this. How many true road games do you have? 1, 2, 3 true road games. Okay, wow, that's interesting. Okay, the 3 true road games at NC State, at Pittsburgh, and at Miami. I think those 3 games, along with the game against Duke at home, are probably going to determine the ceiling of this Louisville team in the ACC. I think that Louisville is better than Duke. I think that they're better than Miami. I think that they're on paper better than NC State. Pittsburgh is kind of up in the air. They did lose a good amount of players. But all 3 of those teams are going to be respectable opponents, and they're all going to be on the road. Historically, NC State has been tough for the Cardinals to beat on the road, although they have done so. Pittsburgh has kind of been hit or miss. Louisville is on a 1-game winning streak against the Panthers. Louisville really hasn't done well with Miami outside of that 2014 win. You're talking about 2 blowout losses to the Hurricanes in back-to-back games. So we'll see how that goes. But, I mean, you're talking about Miami, Pittsburgh, and Duke, and NC State. Maybe they're all kind of up in the air, but I do think that obviously very winnable games. I don't look at one game in this ACC slate and say, I think Louisville's for sure going to lose that game. And I think that that's something to look at. And then you have those games against, Virginia Tech and Virginia and Boston College. I think that Louisville should win all 3 of those games. They're at home. You have that opportunity to play those teams. And like I said, you skip playing Clemson. You skip playing Florida State. You look at Clemson's schedule and how they overlap. I mean, North Carolina has to play Clemson and Florida State. Florida State has to play Clemson. You look at Florida State's schedule, and obviously they have to play Clemson. They have to play Pittsburgh, Miami. They don't have to play North Carolina. But ultimately, I mean, not having to play Clemson, Florida State, or North Carolina, who you're probably not going to be favored to beat, I think that really does make a difference because, this is a situation to where we could be sitting there in mid-October and saying, don't look now, but if these next couple weeks go in a favorable way, Louisville could be on the cusp of sneaking into that AFC Championship game. Obviously, things have to go the right way. The transfers have to seamlessly fit into this team. The returning players have to continue to develop and play solid. You have to win the games you're supposed to win, and obviously that is the prerequisite to all this. And I'm not saying, I don't want the point to be taken that this is going to be something that's going to happen. I'm saying that it's possible. Just because it's possible does not mean that it's probable. But the more you look at it, when you look at the three reasons, when you look at the returning players that they have coming back, when you look at the players that are coming in via the transfer portal and how Jeff Brom addressed the needs of this team, and then you combine that with the favorable schedule, I'm sorry, but I don't see it being far-fetched to suggest that Louisville is the dark horse in the ACC championship conversation. I think at least one of Clemson and Florida State is going to be in that ACC championship game. I would probably argue to say that the ACC championship will be made up of one of Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, or Louisville. Spoiler alert, I mean, those are the top four teams preseason-wise. That might not necessarily be the case, but I'm interested to see how it goes. First game against Georgia Tech. Obviously, the season is still just under 4 months away. So it's slowly creeping up, but still at the end of the day, not too early to talk about next year's team. So that's going to wrap up today's episode of the show. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here